All right, I got my cue to be able to start. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Presidential Climate Commission's Political Economy Dialogue. You're all welcome to this event. Today, we're going to be talking all about the political economy of the just transition. Just by way of an introduction, my name is Lebogang Molaisi, and I'm the COO of the Presidential Climate Commission. Just in terms of background, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, the Presidential Climate Commission is a multi-stakeholder body established by the President. The PCC stems from the Job Summit in 2018, at which social partners expressed concerns about the job impacts of the climate transition. Stakeholders expressed the need for an independent advisory body to chart the path towards net zero and climate resilience in a socially just manner. The Commission includes many government ministers. The Commission also is representative of local government, business, labor, civil society, faith, and science organization. This means that the Commission is, in its nature, a social compacting organization. We discuss issues frankly, and we come to consensus views on matters. We, of course, don't think we represent the sum total of society. This is why whenever we are formulating recommendations, we consult at length with different stakeholders and listen to their views. This gives rise to the series of events that the Commission is undertaking on pertinent issues relevant to the just transition. For those of you who followed, the last Commission meeting was representative of one of those pertinent discussions. In 2022, Cabinet adopted the Just Transition Framework, which provides an overarching frame to guide the transition in the years ahead. The framework sets out the shared vision for a just transition in the country, the principles to guide the transition, and the key policy areas to give effect to the just transition. At the request of Cabinet, the Presidential Climate Commission is now developing a just transition implementation plan, which will now provide further specificity on the role of the various actors in the transition and the timing thereof. The degree in which the just transition will be implemented successfully in South Africa rests strongly on the political economy, especially for South Africa. Accordingly, the discussion today aims to identify the key actors and their ability to exert influence or power to further their priorities with positive or negative impacts on the just transition. The discussion will inform the design of the just transition implementation plan. This event is live streamed on the PCC's social media channels and will be available as a recording on the PCC's event page. Just in terms of today's run of show, we will have an address by the Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister Pravin Gordhan. Following that address, we will then go straight into a curated panel discussion, which will be facilitated by Deepak Patel, who is our Head of Finance and Innovation here at the Presidential Climate Commission. Panelists will include Joanne Yawich, who's the Head of JP PMU, Bobby Peake, the Director of Groundworks, Mr. Mbulaye Mbodi, who is a representative from NUMSA. We'll also have Machete Rakabe, who is the Senior Political Economy Researcher from MISTRA, as well as Lucy Alias, who will also be joining us here today. After that, we'll have an opportunity for there to be a round of questions, and then we'll hand over to the Executive Director of the PCC to give us some closing remarks. Now, in terms of the first and probably the opening address in today's session, I'm going to hand over to the Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister Pravin Gordhan, to then do his opening address. Over to you, Minister. I'm checking, is the Minister online? There we go.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your introductory remarks. I don't have any long speech or anything like that, but let me make somewhere between 5 and 10 points, which hopefully will act as an agitation for our colleagues to engage with a very important topic. So thank you for your invitation to speak. It's a pity my colleague, Minister Creasy, is also not here. So my first point is, I hope that this kind of conversation will extend to many other constituencies in different forms, because underpinning the kind of progress or lack of it that we make from this point onwards in a context where the PCC has done an excellent piece of work in building consensus, in bringing everyone into the tent, so to speak, and contributing to some sense of direction on an important set of climate-related and, of course, broader issues has been quite commendable. So it is in that context that I make the second point, which is that the climate change dynamics seem to be getting worse globally. All the more recent reports leading up to UNGA seem to indicate that the numbers are moving in the wrong direction, that what has overtaken the situation prior to about 18 months ago, as it obtains currently, is national imperatives of one kind or another. And those national imperatives are determining the kind of shape that the global dynamic is actually taking. And primarily, what is interacting with the kind of climate future that we saw painted around COP26 is being slowly diluted, and I stand to be corrected because I don't follow this on an everyday basis, particularly by the emergence of war, the impact on sources of energy, the cost of energy, and the kind of adaptations that different countries in different parts of the world have actually had to make in relation to access to some level of energy security in a climate where their traditional sources of energy security no longer obtain. So the implications of that for the next 2 years or so is something that all of us and the different constituencies in South Africa need to look at, and also ask the question for ourselves, what kind of adaptations, and it's a question that will repeat itself later in what I have to say, do we undertake in order to keep the goal in mind in terms of the nationally declared contribution and the global goal in mind, but at the same time, exercise a level of agility and responsiveness to what is happening around us. So that interaction between climate change, the energy responses of different countries, and their impact on the kind of compacting process that the COPs seem to reflect, particularly at COP26, and slightly before that as well, is an important dynamic to follow as we move to COP28 in Dubai. My third point is that the direction, shape, and the content of this dynamic and interaction is going to be shaped, as you indicate and your topic indicates, by global geopolitics, geoeconomics, and those are nice big terms, but we need to get to the sub-headings, if you like, of each of those, and how they are interacting currently, both within the context of the United Nations, but how they will also interact as we get into these series of COPs, particularly the one that is coming. But the global geopolitics and geoeconomics also influences, if you like, the national political economy. And it would, in one way or another, either support or dilute or divert the kind of dynamics that one would see within a national context, a point that I will come to. So my fourth point is that the global consensus building process is going to go through its own levels of turbulence, particularly given the last 2 years or so, and the lack of resolution in relation to the war in Europe. And some of the factors, and I'm sure our discussion will throw up others, that will contribute in this context is firstly, the North-South political divide. And here, this divide became more sharply profiled, particularly as we were moving towards the BRICS summit in South Africa, where there now seems to be a geopolitical battle, if you like, for the heart and the soul of the South. Meaning that each of the major powers, economic and political, in the world are attempting to woo, in one form or another, various countries in the South to a point where they could receive the political backing of the South through economic incentives of one kind or another, and possibly market access and other forms of incentives as well. And more of that is going to be seen as we get into the future, and how it impacts upon the kind of trajectory that the climate change dynamic and discourse takes is going to be something that we should discuss on the one hand, but also have a set of options developed for ourselves as a country and as the South, and build consensus around that as we attempt the same consensus at a more global level. But there are three, what I call gaps, that we might want to look at more carefully. Firstly, it's the climate gap. Who contributed what to the emissions that we see, and who contributes what to what we have as the current extent of carbon emissions in different parts of the world, and who is doing what about it at this point in time, with some effective impact upon the actual emissions that are taking place. So if you look at the flip side of that, the decarbonization process itself. And to what extent, the second point, which is the technology gap between those who have invested already in R&D, those who have demonstrated manufacturing capability, those who are investing even further in battery technology and other forms of technology. And will that lead to what I've been recently calling a kind of technology nationalism, which means we need to more sharply raise the question, is energy a public good or not? And is access to the key tools that are going to be required for decarbonization and to survive in a decarbonized world public goods, or are they going to be subject to the same commercial tugs of war between those who have that technology capability and those who lack it or are still in the process of developing it? Similarly, the third gap is the financial gap. And here again, the ability to finance one's own transition is still something that is not adequately attended to. There's still the same imbalance in relation to those who have finances will continue to have them. Those who have the financial muscle have shown no willingness of any serious note to support developing countries with their respective transitions, and nor have they used their financial muscle in order to build manufacturing and R&D capability in the developing world, so that we learn from the COVID pandemic and understand what it means to have the level of capacity that's going to be required as we move faster in the new direction. Then my fifth point is that each country will have its own national political economy that connects with the issues that I've raised already. And I think in the South African context, in your introductory note, you've already identified some of the issues, such as the mineral energy complex, the kind of IRP that will emerge through the current processes, and which will provide for the kind of energy mix that we foresee, the extent to which that IRP, let's call it IRP 23, building upon IRP 19, will be influenced by vested interests of one kind or another. And how do we deal with vested interests, which within a national context have their own level of muscle, so to speak, and lobbying capability, as we've already seen in various environments. So that's the first of the issues. The second is the majority of our people are still pretty much on the margin of both these debates and developments, and the extent to which they are impacted by modifications in the current energy provision, meaning more politely, I'm actually saying, if we slow down the performance of some of the coal-powered stations or repurpose them or whatever the case might be, what's the actual impact on communities and workers? So whilst there is a fair amount of discussion around these issues, and there have been dipsticks, if you like, particularly by yourselves, but allegedly by Eskom as well, do we fully understand the consequences that will have to be borne by the majority of people and workers? And what institutional, financial, and other arrangements are we making in order that we can go through the just part of the transition in as painless a way as possible, but where communities and workers are better off, not just the same, on the other side of the line, so to speak, as we migrate through this process. So I think these and other national issues, and this is where the concept of political economy comes in. What political choices are going to be made? How will vested interests actually influence those political choices? Where will the economic muscle come from? How will we, as both the state and the private sector and the NGO sector, create a new economic dynamic, which will result in R&D of a particular type, which will result in new industries, which will result in the financing of those industries, which will result in plants being created in appropriate places, which will give us some level of autonomy from the technology gap that I spoke about earlier on, but also the financial gap. And how are the workers, both those that are currently called workers, but the new generations of workers, going to be provided with the skills? And do we have the institutional mechanisms, even in a very primitive form, ready to take on the responsibilities? I think is a key question. So a lot needs to be invested as part of understanding our own political economy, in understanding the impacts on people and communities and workers. But more importantly, understanding those impacts is one thing. The more important issue is starting the processes, and in some instances, they might well be there in a primitive form, but starting the processes which will give us the institutional capacity to respond to some of these challenges and help people through them. A key element, and which is my sixth point, is then the issue of industrial policy in this context, and whether industrial policy is in fact keeping in line with the kind of developments that we actually foresee, and whether we can create the right partnerships between the private and the public sector, but also the working class as well, in order to give effect, not just to a policy document, but actual industries being created, which show people that we have the capacity in South Africa to undertake let's call it the industrial transition, which is going to be just as important a component as the other transitions that we are talking about. So the pace at which that happens, the kind of just content of some of those changes is going to be as important as conceptualizing some of these particular areas. My last point, which is the seventh point, is that in the overall context of what I'm saying, South Africa will have its own idiosyncratic set of dynamics as we go through the transition. And we in a sense, need to give it some shape, build on the good work that you've done up to now, and the work that is happening in other sectors like government and so on, and in the private sector, and try to build the next level of consensus, so to speak, on how we tie the different elements together, develop a conception of what we mean by national interest in this particular case, notwithstanding the divergences that we might have amongst ourselves, and close the gaps amongst different constituencies rather than exacerbate them in the way in which we approach some of the discussions. There's absolutely no doubt that the political, the economic, and the social, and the technical are going to be interacting with one another in ways that we might not have anticipated up to this point in time. And therefore, the capacity to be agile and responsive and open to understanding these new trends is going to be quite critical as we go forward. So once again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Godan, for those reflections. I think there are important ways in which we need to frame today's discussion. One of the things that you touched on, which I think is quite vital for us to consider, especially those of us who are working in this space, is the difficulty ahead in the next 2 to 3 years. The geopolitics, the geoeconomics are quite palpable, and they are playing quite a vital role in the national political economies of various countries, South Africa being one of them, and also highlighting the issue of South Africa's mineral energies complex and how divisive that has been, especially in the discussions to date, because like you said, there are various vested interests, but how do we balance those in order to make the correct political choices moving forward? The danger is always that if we don't make the right political economy, we don't make the right political questions, we run the risk of jeopardizing the transition and making it just. And I think just the last point that you made around this, the pace of the transition is also going to be a question of South Africa's national political economy. So it's important to make the correct decisions now. Thank you for that, Minister, and thank you for joining us for this discussion. With that said, I'm going to then hand over to Deepak Patel, who will then take us through the panel discussion. Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you very much, Lebakang. And thank you, Minister in the PCC, we often debate what is science and what is not science. And I think what you've sketched for us is the validity of the scientific method in our analysis of who we are as a country, but also where we fit in to the global realities, both political and economic, and I would argue in some senses social as well. I think you've also given us a broad frame within which to answer some critical questions related to, on the basis of analysis, which amongst some of us of a certain leaning is also a scientific method. How do you then forge a strategic set of intents? And more importantly, as you know, Minister, from your whole life of endeavor, that strategic intent on its own is not worth anything. It is, in fact, a unity in action that propels us into achieving the strategic outcomes that we initially set out to achieve. To unpack some of these issues, particularly in the national context and realities that we face in our political economy in South Africa, located in a very complex geopolitical and geoeconomic environment, we have firstly Joanne Yavich, who is the head of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan Project Management Unit, which is located in the presidency. Joanne is also a commissioner of the PCC, and previously she was chief executive of the NBI, the National Business Initiative. I think she, given her engagements with the IPG in the context of the JET partnership, is really well placed in frankly enunciating and sharing with us the experience that she's had in that very complicated geopolitical and geofinancial context. We then have Bobby Peake, who is a director of groundwork and is also a PCC commissioner. Bobby has the cutting edge experience of having grown up along the fence line of the Durban Engine Oil Refinery, a facility that is well known to those who come from Durban. And Bobby, in his work, is also quite firmly grounded in community-based activism as well as work. And I think Bobby can provide a lot of perspective with respect to the role of communities and society broadly in the transition that we have already begun and that we need to speed up. Then we have Mbulaeni Mbodi, who is also a PCC commissioner. He's also a member and an official at NUMSA. He's the National Secretary of the National Shop Stewards Council in Eskom, and he has also been on the front line. Having been both an activist and an organizer of workers, as well as being a commissioner, he is really well placed to indicate to us what kind of social compacting is required as we move forward in a united fashion. Then we have Dr. Faiza Balam, who is a senior lecturer and the head of Department of History at UJ. Through her work, Dr. Balam focuses on the intersection issues that you have raised, Minister, of science, technology, and economics. Dr. Balam has previously published on agricultural cooperatives and urban racial segregation in a small town in Limpopo. She has also recently released a book focused on Eskom titled Power, Politics, and the, in parenthesis, post-apartheid state. Then we have Mashete Eddie Rakabe. He's a senior researcher for political economy at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA. Prior to joining MISTRA, Eddie worked for Financial and Fiscal Commission, heading up the Fiscal Policy Division. He is also a lead economist for the South African Square Kilometre Array and the National Research Foundation. He is going to be well placed to talk to some of the macrofinance as well as deeply economic issues pertaining to our transition. I'm going to call on, in the order in which I've introduced them, each of the panelists to reflect, Minister, on what you've said, but more importantly, to frankly and honestly share with us, based on their experience, on their studies and their own analysis, what the key issues are related to South Africa's positioning based on its political economy in order to meet the dual objectives of climate response while we ensure that we locate effectively and successfully for our own national political, economic, strategic benefit going forward. Joanne, the floor is yours, and I will ask each person to try to confine themselves to between 3 and 4 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, and morning to everybody on the call. Thanks to the PCC, and thanks, Minister, for that input. Deepak, I know you want me to talk about the JET IP and the experience with the IPG, but I do think that there is probably an issue that I think the Minister touched on, which is really about, if we're talking about political economy, is an issue around what is the current balance of forces, and where do we sit as a country, and how do we understand how we position ourselves and what are our aspirations internationally. And I do think that it is important in the context of climate, and in particular in the context of this JETP partnership, to really look at the role that South Africa has played along with the rest of the African continent in relation to asserting a particular interpretation and understanding of the way that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change works and the reasons for that. And really, I mean, I think it is really important that the architecture of that, which gave rise to this JETP partnership, stresses the fact that developed countries have a much greater obligation in relation to climate change than developing countries, and that developed countries have an obligation and an obligation to support developing countries. And in the language of the convention, we talk about taking account of our national circumstances and taking account of what we call our common but differentiated responsibilities. And I think that is critically important, because the debate around climate change, there's a debate around the science and there's a debate around the money. I mean, that's simplifying it hugely. And I think that in the debate around the money that has been going on for the best part of the last 2 decades, there's been a very long struggle by developing countries to get the developed world to put money on the table to meet the obligations that are set out in the convention, and more specifically in the Paris Agreement. And I think that where we need to locate the JET partnership and the investment plan that emanated from that is very firmly in the context of that international architecture and in the context of those obligations. And I think that if you don't locate it there, and if you don't locate it as part of a broader international, I don't know, the word is struggle between the developed and the developing world to get that appropriate balance between obligations and responsibilities, I think that we can't really go back and say, where are we as a country and what is the importance of this and how do we use it in such a way that it supports our own socio-economic and developmental objectives as a country. So I thought that would be an important point to make. I think the second thing is that when we look at this JET investment plan and the JET partnership, it is important to start to build a common understanding of where we sit as a country relative to other countries, both on the continent and in the world. And in particular, to look at what are our current challenges. And part of our challenges are straight geographical. We sit right at the tip of Africa, very far. We're very, very far from many of our trading partners. We're a small open economy. We are essentially still a primary producer of minerals and other commodities that go elsewhere to be processed and beneficiated. And a lot of the issues around the transition, I think, relate straight back to that. And how do we want to go forward as a country? Do we want to stay in that situation also as quite a low productivity country? Or do we want to change the way that we produce and the way that we consume and what it is, the way we fit into that global economy. So I think that there are a set of really big political economy debates that need to fit in or to inform and understand where we are at as a country. In relation to your specific point about the JETP partnership, the only point I want to make at this point in time is that we did negotiate an agreement with the International Partners Group. But as a country, the approach that we took is that we wanted to set our national objectives up front and our set of aspirations as a country in relation to the transition up front and the way we want to do it as a country. And then we wanted the IPG to fit in and support that. And I think that that, again, is terribly important. This notion of something that is country-led rather than being led by your partners and by your lenders and your financiers, I think is a fundamentally important issue. And in putting forward an investment plan that looked at the entire scope of what would be required in South Africa rather than the finance package on the table, I think it was saying in a very, very clear way that we want to set the terms of what it is that is required and see this partnership as part of a much bigger process and undertaking. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Joanne. Next up is Bobby. If you can please take about 4 minutes, not much more than that. You have some very rich experiences as well as perspectives to share from the vantage point as a community organizer, activist, and advocate. Bobby, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and good morning, Minister, and thanks for your words and your clarity, as always, on these issues. And I think the clarity does stem around two issues very quickly. One is around taking other constituencies and working with other constituencies, and that's what's really important in terms of whatever development plan we need and whatever political economy we're talking about. We have to make sure that people on the ground that are next to the coal-fired power stations, next to the oil refineries, are actually part of this debate. The other thing which I thought was also extremely clear from your discussion was the issue around, building a partnership around technology and around the going forward between PCC, government, and the private sector working together. But what is left out of there is civil society, and what is left out of there is labor. And I think that's why we're sitting with a problem presently with green hydrogen in particular, where business and government has bolted out the stables, and they've developed a green hydrogen plan for the country, and they're going to bring it back to society and say, this is what we're going to do. And I think that's fundamentally incorrect, and it's something that you would not want. And considering your deep history and how you engage with people on the ground, and I think it's something that we need to deal with quite urgently. We also know that it is urgent. I mean, but there is a just process here. The IPC has acknowledged that you can respond to climate change as an opportunity to transform society to one where we all can flourish, and that for me is critical. And that transformation means some hard choices. And I am very frustrated by the global politic where Sunak and Biden can do whatever they want to do and go back on commitments. And I think, we've been working hard with our counterparts in the North to say that deal with your governments. Stop just criticizing, deal with your governments, because that's where the flaw first starts. And, they got rich because they looted Africa. So that is really important. But at the end of the day, we are constrained. We can't produce any more carbon. So it is essential that we all have to take a position of no more coal, gas, and oil drilling and drilling in the ocean. Because renewables is cheaper. Renewables are cheaper, and it can provide an industrial strategy that you asked for. It's not about an industrial strategy that puts solar panels on people's roofs throughout the country, which I believe should be the first strategy. Every country in this house, rich or poor, must have a solar panel that feeds into the grid and saves Eskom and saves us. We can't leave energy provision to IPPs And, the unions and civil society speak very strongly about that. Renewable energy must be in the control of people, in the control of local governments, and in control of workers. And for me, that will give us a better economy for the future. Now, getting back to the challenges around South Durban and the oil refineries in Mpumalanga, when we talk about rehabilitation, we need to recognize that in terms of a politic that serves people first and an economy that serves people first in these areas, then their provinces, then national, and then the global is how we should operate. And that fundamentally starts at rehabilitation of the local lands and the local water and restoring people's health. Because when we have healthy people, healthy lands, and clean water, we can build an economy, and it must be an economy that serves people first rather than corporates. Because I think there is a conflict around this just transition, because there's this thing called energy, and corporates love the energy transition, and they put J in there just because they need to keep the economy the way it operates, extractive in nature. And by putting just in there, they are happy that the energy system will change, but the system will not change. And for us, that is critically flawed, because we want a change of the system. And so what we have presently is what we call, the status quo versus the people. There's a conflict of interest between the elite, both corporates and the political. And it's not nice reading, the fact that, state capture 2.0 now and could be happening with China. I think those are the things we do not want to read. We want to learn from what has happened. And so we don't want to keep the status quo. We want to move. And we have to move in a way that deals with climate change and ensures that justice and equity is the process, and justice and equity is the outcome. And that for groundwork and for the people we work with, that is critical. So we also need to be able to think very carefully about how corporates globally, and because this is about the global political economy, come to the table with false solutions. And those false solutions, as I mentioned early on, keep the system going, but they just greenwash, the process to make us believe that they're doing something different. And let us remember, when the oil price skyrocketed last year, it was those very same companies, thanks Deepak, I'll do that in 30 seconds. It was those very same companies that were screaming, green, we need to develop new economies. When the oil price went high, they dived in to make super profits. So for us, that's a major flaw. We need to be able to deal with that intense contradiction in what we're facing. And indeed, Jan, that contradiction is within the UNFCCC, because the UNFCCC is not about saving people's lives and the planet. It's about saving corporate profits and the economy. And that's why in 28 years, we have not advanced, and we're just going deeper and deeper into the crisis. Thanks, Deepak.
Thank you very much for that, Commissioner and Comrade Peak. Next up is Commissioner and Comrade Mbodi. Please, the floor is yours. If you can, I'm going to show you a sign at 4.5 minutes. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. Okay, I'm trying to start my video. Okay. Thank you so very much. I think it is very, very important to thank the Minister for his input. Very, very important. And I'm still digesting a lot of what he has put on the table. I just want to highlight something that is very, very important here. The debate of just transition and dealing with climate issues in the country, it's easier to move away from where it is supposed to be, to just merely become a technological debate. A debate about what technology and how the technology will be implemented and whatnot. Versus, remember, we are in South Africa, we have got unemployment, we've got poverty, we've got inequality, and we need to address all those issues. On the other hand, we've got a crisis of energy crisis, which depends the same things that one has already raised. And I think it is important to locate socio-economic issues and deal with them decisively so as to address the issues of the many of our people who are languishing in poverty, who are unemployed, and who are having income inequality as an issue. Now, just to make this point, I think it is important to also realize that when dealing with just transition, we need to also think of socially owned renewable sector, or making sure that the sector is not a runaway gain for big businesses. We should also be considerate of the fact that there is a way to involve the poor and the working class in running schemes that can run your socially owned renewable sector, or to involve them in boards if you have got a socially owned company that is doing the same, to make sure that they play a part, the poor and the working class, who are the majority of our people, to play a leading role in developing, in growing, and also in getting the economic benefit. I think it is very, very important to note that jobs and livelihoods are at the center of what we are doing. If we do not make this a socio-economic issue also, we run a risk of having it as a technological debate, which benefits only big businesses, manufacturers. By the way, geoeconomics and geopolitics will tell you that the manufacturers of those technologies are not, we are not part of those manufacturers. You know, the technologies are being manufactured elsewhere. We will end up being the consumers, and even though we involve ourselves in that debate with no benefit for the majority of our people. And I think it is also important, when promises are made of where jobs will come from, we also look at the type of jobs, because we are talking political economy. But we must also be considerate of the fact that there are certain things that stems out of the power of government in formulating policies and direction for the country, but also guarding that we do not overcommit ourselves in loans and be pushed to the corner by the global north, because the global north, I don't want to believe that the global north is really thinking about how to please the population of South Africa and get them out of the quagmire of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. I do believe that the bigger scheme of things is making sure that money, they gain money. I don't want to believe from where I'm sitting as Nomsa that there is a very, very strong desire to just help, because if there was such, the grant aspect of the financing was going to go up, reparation was going to go up. But people are telling us of loans that are cheaper, that are not as strong as those that are in the commercial, what you call, market. And I think it is important to note that the poor and the working class are looking and listening at what decisions we make. As the PCC, we may not be happy to find ourselves pleasing the partners, pleasing everybody else, and losing ground with our people who are the majority. And let me close by saying this. I think we need to also be able to try to get the government to formalize some the informal sector. You know, somebody must do a bidding for them, because we believe that there's quite a lot of jobs that can come out of that. And we also do believe that the issue, the divide between urban and rural, also talks to the wealthy and the poor, because the rural are more likely poor, including the municipalities that are there. We should find policy instruments that shows that we are decisively dealing with the issues of the income divide when we're dealing with just transition and climate change issues. I will stop here. There's quite a lot to say, but I will stop here because 4 minutes is not big enough to can cover the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Comrade Mbodi. We will come back to you. Dr. Ballum, you're up next. I am going to show that sign when it's time for you to wrap up. Thank you very much. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and to all the panelists for your interesting contributions. Sorry. So I think that the question that you opened with is a very important question about the validity of the scientific question. And particularly, I think it relates to the question of how much ESCOM can be trusted to manage the transition itself. And it does have a history, which is what I found as a historian, looking at its activity in the Eastern Transvaal, of being very suspicious of people who tried to curb its activity for environmental reason. And it fought, for example, with the air pollution officer who tried to limit its construction of a power station there because of the amount of saturation of sulfur dioxide levels in the region. And so it fought with the air pollution officer's control. And similarly, we've seen suspicions of environmental organizations such as Greenpeace at the construction of the Medupi power station. So I think that ESCOM itself has scientists and engineers within the organization. And so they would claim to know what the appropriate procedures to follow are. And even with the construction of Medupi, they promised to limit harmful gas emission, such as by installing flue gas desulfurization technology, which does not seem to have materialized yet. And their priority now is to keep the lights on, which is a priority that many of us do sympathize with and can see the value of. And I think that leads on to my next point, which is about the huge contestation around this issue of a transition to an energy system that appreciates climate change. And a part of this, which I think comes through in many of the speeches, is about the short-termism of people's salaries and people's livelihoods versus the long-term effects of climate change. And these effects we have not fully seen yet. We will, but we haven't yet reached the catastrophic proportions that promises to arrive. And I think that they are all equally valid concerns that need to be taken into account. But I think that the problem also with this overriding priority to end load shedding, which also has an employment rationale behind it, because ending load shedding is important to ensuring economic growth, which is also important to ensuring that people have jobs. And that, I think, has the potential to override the consultative processes that are necessary going forward, including processes that include workers, but also people who live in the vicinity of coal mines, who live in the vicinity of power stations, and also this concern for the long-term effects of climate change, which I mentioned. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
You caught me unawares. Thank you very much for giving me back at least 1 full minute. Next up is Machete Eddie Rakabe from Mistra. The floor is yours. 4 minutes or so, please. Thank you. Please unmute.
Yeah, I'd like to take a little bit of a historical, background to this discussion around just transition, just to indicate that environmental sustainability has actually been on the global agenda for quite some time. In 2002, South Africa hosted the World Summit on Sustainable Development. It was attended by about 100 or so head of states. A number of commitments were made then. But I think to indicate the point is that we also agreed to the 8 Millennium Development Goals. Goal 7 was about environmental sustainability. We've had a number of initiatives where we promised, some of which include the Millennium Development Fund. But in 2015, when we transitioned to the SDG, many of those goals, Millennium Development Goals, had not been met because the resources that we promised then had not been made available. And yet we continued again with the SDGs. In 2016, the UN adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 7 and 13 specifically speak about just transition. So Goal 7 is about affordable and clean energy. Goal 13 is about climate action. Now, when you look at Africa, especially with respect to Goal 7, we've got about 4 in 5 people in Africa do not have access to electricity. And yet the resources that the world is making available for transitioning to affordable and clean energy is dwindling. From 26 billion in 2017, now we're sitting at about 26 billion US dollars per annum. So we're making these commitments about transitioning to clean energy, and yet we're not making the resources available despite all the commitments that are made at international multilateral organizations. With respect to Goal 17 on climate action, we've made commitment to reduce greenhouse emissions by 43% in 2030, and we've also agreed to net zero, a goal by 2050, which in my view is a little bit over ambitious. When you look at Africa, we need about 6 trillion US dollars by 2030 in order to achieve our greenhouse emission reduction targets. So the 60 trillion for 54 African countries. The resources are not available still. The money that is available currently is about, we're working it out at around 800 billion US dollars per annum, but also that is also fluctuating per annum. So the point I'm trying to make here is that since the signing of the SDG in 2050, now we find ourselves sitting in a situation where Goal 13 and 7 has now been elevated as these apex developmental goals. And it appears to me that all these other SDG actually dependent on it. And this has been, identified by some of these powerful interest groupings that the minister has spoken about, especially the Global North, because they are the financiers, they still hold licenses and rights to some of the global fossil fuel reserves. And yet, when you look at the Global South, we are mainly the suppliers. We are just the beneficiaries of this. We're supposed to be the beneficiary of this financing from the global North. But the questions that we've got to be asking ourselves as a continent and as Africa specifically is, what does this just transition mean for Angola, for instance, which depends 90% for their revenue on fossil fuels, or the revenue from some of the sales they make on oil, for example. What does just transition mean for Botswana, which has got about 2 trillion cattle, a head of cattle? And we've heard stories about farmers in Ireland having been forced to cull about 200 head of cattle. So what would this transition mean for the farmers in Botswana? Bring it back home, what does this transition mean for the communities in Lephalale, in Witbank, in Sasolburg, for instance? If we continue with this just transition, how ready are we for this transition? Because we are now still talking about transition as if it's something that is going to be happening in the future. We're talking about industrial development as part of the just transition. So even at the current moment, just transition has not just become this, IPEX global development agenda. It's also become some kind of an industrialization agenda. We see it as some kind of an industrialization lever. So we're using this crisis as an industrialization lever. But we're talking about it as if it's something that is still going to be happening in the future, and yet it is happening now. So there are many countries which have already taken advantage of this transition. China is one of the examples. So when we talk about industrial development for adaptation strategies for industrial development, other countries are already doing that now. When you talk about skills development for just transition,
start rounding up. Thank you.
Other countries are doing that now. So I think for me the main issue here, whether we survive this transition or not, will depend on the responsiveness of the institutions which are responsible for providing an enabling environment to mitigate and also take advantage of the just transition. But also importantly is to how do we define the timeline for the just transition for ourselves, because it's not just going to be an open-ended transition. So we need to have those time limitations. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panel for that. For the next short while, I'm going to be asking questions off my sheet to each of the panelists, and then we'll come to the questions in the Q&A. Firstly, we've talked about the imperative for a political economy orientation to the just transition. And in this context, the PCC has provided a just transition framework which seeks to enunciate the elements of justice that should be firmly embedded and made front and center of South Africa's just transition. Commissioner Mbodi, may I pick on you to unpack for us who you think the critical social partners are in enabling this just transition to proceed in South Africa's geopolitical as well as global context, and that will ensure that South African society and economy are beneficiaries as we undertake this transition.
Okay, I think what is important, the partners that one thinks can make the just transition to work better. I think these partnerships between the workers and the climate justice movement is very, very important, because people might imagine that the workers are not worried about the climate. But there is an equal worry for the climate. We are just striving for a balance, that as we address climate change issues, we must not ignore certain other issues. And we believe that the responsibility between the climate justice movement and the trade unions is out there, and we have already seen how it operates, because we are talking about the protection of the vulnerable impacted companies, and so that jobs and livelihoods may not be lost. The others is between the workers and the communities, because we do believe there should be a very good marriage of the community struggles and the shop floor struggles, because they involve our people. We do not stay as workers in the factories. When we are done working, we go back and become part of the society. So the societal challenges and the shop floor struggles, they are supposed to be married. And so there is supposed to be a very, very good and better working relationship between workers and the communities. And if we do that, it will be it will work better. But again, I think we also have got the workers and the government partnership, which is very, very important, because the government is part of the policymakers and directors of they also are in charge of the managing the fiscals, and they know exactly the needs of the country. They are able to can quantify this and that. So as the workers and the government, we should be able to have even more robust engagement and meeting of minds and partnership in order to gain a deal for the poor and the working class. We do believe that that is very, very important. And we can't exclude the relationship between the workers and the business, because business is the employer. That relationship, bittersweet as it is a very, very important relationship that can, if we sit together and say this is a sectoral just transition plan for a certain company, the workers must be taken on board, fully on board, so that they understand what the business is moving towards, so that we may get a deal for our people. And I think it is not about the workers alone. It is about the country getting the best deal for everyone, making sure that there is equitable share of the spoil or the economic benefit.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mbodi. Bobby, I want to turn to you. Commissioner Mbodi has articulated who the social partners in this bid to have united or a united vision going forward should be. We do know, however, that the transition is contested terrain. Do you want to unpack for us some of the essential power relations amongst the social partners and what needs to be done to be able to forge a united or a unity in action through the just transition, despite what power relations might exist and despite what contradictions might exist.
Thanks, Deepak. Yeah, I mean, there are glaring contradictions in this reality. And I reflect back on our deputy chair, who visited South Durban when our deputy chair was Minister of Environment in 2000, when the South Durban people finally gave evidence of health problems and of pollution problems in the South Durban area. They developed the science. We talk about scientific. They gave the science over, and they could not be ignored. So Minister Irwin, Minister Musa, and Minister MEC Mike Mamoyo-Kula was there. And what we developed out of that process is what we call a multi-point plan, where we all sat together over the next few years, and communities even, said to the Norwegian government, please support South Durban. And we signed off, or we endorsed a bilateral where millions of rands was supporting the development of good governance in the South Durban Health Department. So that process worked well because we worked together to be part of governance. We didn't just shout, which we still did. We didn't just, threaten with legal action, which we still did, but we worked together around with local governments and with national governments around good governance. And the same thing happened after the floods last year. When the floods went through Durban, we didn't take government to court. We didn't throw stones at government. We realized we had to work with government. So we wanted to be part of governance because our constitution gives us that right. So that's where the social partnership first starts, is about being part of governance. And if we can't be part of governance, there will be no social partnership. But what happened was, and here's the contradiction, when the South Durban multi-point plan started fingering the corporates in South Durban to say, you are polluting, you are responsible, behind closed doors, the corporates managed to dismantle that governance system that was set up in South Durban. And they did it by putting pressure on local government, who then caved in. Now, you're going to ask me, where's the evidence for that, Bobby? Go and speak to the South Durban people and speak to, officials who worked in the South Durban area, and just look at the headlines of the newspapers during that day. So that is really important. So the contradictions lie in the fact that the present neoliberal macroeconomic system and policies protect the rich and the elite. And what it does, as you know, and as the minister knows, it's put pressure on the system, and it leads to austerity. And so the poor suffer in this case because we have to save money for the state. But for me, is if you put money into people's hands, i.e., a universal basic income grant, that money is going to filter through our economy. And so it's really important that we need to make sure that we also undo the process that filters into a type of neoliberal macroeconomic system of corruption and protecting those that are corrupt. So those are the contradictions at hand. And we need to be able to come out into the open, which the PCC has done, I think, really well. We've gone to many rural areas and spoken to people. Now we need for all of government to do that, because that's where the partnership and that's where good governance will start. And then we'll break down these contradictions that we face.
Thank you very much for that, Bobby. Joanne, I'm going to turn to you. I found it quite interesting that amongst the words you used in your initial address was struggle. But that was in the context of our country as a whole struggling in the international environment. What we're hearing both from Bobby as well as Mbodi is that we have an internal struggle as well, depending on whether we're talking about different social partners, or whether we're talking to the elite or the marginalized. Can you share with us your perspective, particularly in the face of the reality of South Africa's industrial architecture as it exists now? What are the prospects for South Africa being able to navigate this complex path as we undertake a climate change response, as well as ensure that we have our own political, economic, and social development process that accompanies that climate response?
Okay, yeah, I think that clearly, Deepak, there is, we're not only the most unequal society in the world, we have race-based inequality, and we have a very complex class struggle in this country, including the fact that we have such a high proportion of our population are unemployed, means that the issue of solidarity among the working class is a very, very huge issue, how you build that. And also intergenerational solidarity in this country, given the numbers of our youth who don't have jobs and may never have jobs. So I think that we have, I mean, the struggles that we fight out in society are myriad and complex. And the question, I think that where South Africa at points in its history has been able, and in points post and in the process of the transition to democracy, has been able to do things very well, is to find areas where across society and despite a set of different interests, people can find sufficient consensus to be able to move forward jointly, even if it's on quite a narrow set of issues. And I think that that is what, when the last input from Mpulaheni kind of addressed that issue about where do you find ways to move forward despite the fact that there is a broader struggle in society. You must remember that I come out of the era when you went to university and you learned Marxism. So I think that for me is the context. I do think that we are in a very difficult position in relation to industry in South Africa. I mean, clearly our economy has been built on huge exploitation of people by the owners of capital. I think in particular the mining base of our economy, and I don't need to go into the history of exploitation that it has been founded on. I think that where industry is at the moment, clearly things have moved in some ways, they haven't moved in others. But I think that there is enormous pressure on industry in South Africa to transform. I think there are a set of external threats on the one hand, and a set of issues around sustainability on the other. And in addition, the legal framework that the country put in place post-democracy around issues of both worker health and safety and environmental health and safety, that has forced industry to start to transform in very important ways. But I do believe that with things like the threat of CBAM and the threat of trade barriers on high carbon exports from South Africa, that we are in a very vulnerable position as a country, let alone the kind of all of the other crises that we are seeing in South African business and in state-owned companies about the inability to get goods to market, the costs issues around what it is that we produce and whether there is a long-term market. And that has forced much of business to look, I think, at what it is producing, how it is producing it, and they're saying, if we want to survive into the long term, we're going to need to do things differently. And I think that needs to become a much broader social conversation. Can't be a conversation that sits in boardrooms only. It's got to be a conversation that is held with between employers and employees. It is a conversation that affects communities. It is a conversation that obviously is critical to government in terms of our long-term industrial policy and what government needs to do in order to support and enable that. So I don't think that South Africa as a country, whatever we decide is going to be able to avoid the kinds of changes and transformation. I mean, on the one hand, it is, I suppose, a move to cleaner forms of production and consumption. It's also a move to digitization, linked to that in some ways and separate from it in others, that is going to fundamentally change the nature of the way that we work as a country and the nature of the skills that are needed in order for people to be able to get jobs, the kind of job progression they have, the way that work is organized. So I think that we are in the middle. I mean, change is happening around the world very, very rapidly. Used to take a very long time for change to be enforced. It happens much, much faster now than it ever did. And I think it's something that either you let it wash over you and you're a taker, or you take control of it and you can structure it. And I think that's what we need to be doing.
Thank you very much for that, Joanne. There are questions in the Q&A function, which I'm going to try to group together. So if I don't attribute the question to you as an individual, please forgive me. There are a number of questions related to regional cooperation and South Africa's place in the region. Eddie, I'm going to ask you from a macroeconomic, macro-fiscal, as well as political economy point of view, to talk to us about whether we stand alone as a country in this transition or whether there are regional, for want of a better word, opportunities to work together with our neighbors.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, there are regional opportunities. I mean, if you look at South Africa, we are part of SADC, and many of these SADC countries, we contribute a lot to their revenues, and I think from the perspective of Goal 7, for instance, which actually deals with the access to clean and affordable energy, South Africa is actually an opportunity there. We might have a situation currently in the sense that we've got an energy crisis, and therefore we've got to be sourcing energy from our regional partners. But going forward, because of the space that South Africa takes within the regional economy, there are opportunities for South Africa to provide the lead in terms of industrial upgrading, especially in some of our neighboring countries, Lesotho and Mozambique and in Zimbabwe. So there are opportunities for some of the South African companies to operate there, also to assist with the industrial upgrading. But I think for me, the greater threat, I suppose, would essentially come from if we don't have a very planned transition, especially from a regional level, and to the extent that it then affects the movement patterns within the region. As we know, we've got a very serious problem of migration in South Africa, which is a very topical issue, and the extent to which the mismanagement or lack of better management of the transition would affect the movement patterns, and how would then affect eventually would then affect the functioning of some of the economies within the region. So there are opportunities, but I think to me there are more challenges that we actually need to be managing. But in terms of the opportunities, I actually see much more opportunities in terms of the industrial upgrading. From a macroeconomic perspective, I suppose the most important thing to note there is that with the economic perspective, we need some kind of stability, macroeconomic stability within the region. And stability depends on quite a number of things, one of which is our ability to produce highly diversified products, but also importantly, you cannot produce highly diversified products if you don't have access to reliable energy. So going forward is about the extent to which the region as a whole come together to invest in green energy, but also to reduce greenhouse emissions in such a way that we don't necessarily interfere with the people's livelihoods, many of which still rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. So I suppose the compact that we need at the regional level is between, we need a compact for lack of a better word, the likely losers from the transition, to look at how we then position agriculture as one of the key drivers of development within the region, so that the people who are still relying on that sector don't necessarily lose out. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Eddie. Faiza, you asked a very provocative, but I suppose many will agree with you, question. Can Eskom be trusted? Would you agree that Eskom is a critical part of the solution going forward, particularly with respect to energy security right now, but just as importantly with respect to the infrastructure rollout that we need to see taking place on our grid if we are to meet all of our other economic, social, and industrial needs?
Thank you, Deepak. I agree that Eskom is an integral part of this, in large part because they continue to own all the infrastructure that is necessary for electrification at a national level. I think that renewable energy offers the possibility for a more decentralized system of energy provision, because it offers the possibility for independent power providers to contribute to the grid, which is what is happening. But I think that Eskom remains crucial. It remains important, particularly because many people in this country will not be able to afford electricity if a private producer were ever to set tariffs at its own volition. And also I think the new infrastructure is a difficult question, because I think there's the question of what kind of infrastructure are we talking about? Is it new power stations? What kind of power stations would those be? And the experience of Medupi and Kusile has shown us that Eskom has struggled to build these power stations efficiently in the time that they said they would, and in a cost-efficient way. So it's very difficult to know what the new infrastructure is going to be like. But I think it's also important, especially since we are now in an era of democracy. That era also means that we treat the experts with some degree of suspicion. So we no longer presume that they know all the answers, the kind of scientists and the engineers, and we allow for these important consultative procedures that affects the lives of people in the country. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to take a broad sweep of questions from the Q&A now and invite any member of the panel to raise their hand to take them. One relates to the issue of green hydrogen, and in reference, Bobby, to a comment that you made. Why is green hydrogen such an important element of our transition going forward? And what did you mean, Bobby, when you said it ran away without adequate consultation? And keep it brief,
so, yeah. So, Deepak, at the Presidential Climate Commission meeting on Friday, it was clear with the presentation by, on behalf of Minister Patel, that the entire construction of this green hydrogen economy has been deeply thought about, engaged with, and it was said, it was engaged. Government engaged industry, industry engaged government on this, and they've got this plan. Now, this plan is to roll out green hydrogen as a new feedstock for producing energy in the future, and a whole lot of other goods, right? Now, I'm not a fundi, an expert on green hydrogen, but what I am an expert on is the fact that we've been left behind and that a new economy is being developed based upon a system that doesn't talk about delivering services to people first. People in townships do not worry about green hydrogen. People in townships do not worry about climate change. What people in townships want is our houses not being flooded. We want safe transport. We want access to data. We want good health systems. We want an education system, and we've heard this from people throughout the country, that creates, functional adults. So in terms of green hydrogen, we have to ask the question, green hydrogen for whom? And if it is green hydrogen is going to be developed in South Africa for the sectors of the economy or industry that will find it difficult to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then let's figure out how we do that for our economy, right? That's really important. And critically, when we look at green hydrogen, we must not make green hydrogen the silver bullet for Sasol. Sasol was created by the apartheid state using the Fischer-Tropsch technology, which was terribly polluting and is terribly polluting. Sasol in Secunda cannot meet its emission standards that it has to meet. And so they are looking at green hydrogen as a solution for Sasol. And do we save Sasol? Yes, we should be saving Sasol because they're important for the economy. But what's critical is that we cannot give Sasol a third opportunity at this cherry. One, the state created Sasol. Two, they did not have a windfall tax. And three, we must be careful that we don't give them more money and give their shareholders profits by this process of green hydrogen. So what you can hear I'm saying, Deepak, is that lots of conversation still needs to happen. And not only in this sphere, but in the sphere of people in the Northern Cape who are going to be impacted upon this, people in the Vaal, people in the Eastern Cape, people in Mpumalanga, and most importantly, this type of new corridor that has been spoken about in Limpopo. That's where the green hydrogen debate has to happen. And the minister has said so in the beginning, in his opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Bobby. I thought I'd put that into the mix, particularly because we know that there are certain contested terrain elements to our transition and fundamentals of our political economy. I'm going to ask one more question to a targeted panel member. Then if people online, I will give you a chance over the next 15 to 20 minutes to either ask a question, which I dissuade you from doing, but if you wanted to make quick comments, no more than 1 minute each, please indicate by raising your hands, and I will call and allow you to have an open mic for a minute each. I want to turn to Commissioner Mbodi. Commissioner Mbodi, political economy is at its heart the nexus point between politics, economics, and society, I believe. In this whole debate around who has what role to play in forging a prosperous economy that produces jobs and livelihoods, while at the same time we give effect to all of the three types of justice that are enunciated in our just transition framework. We have to make certain choices. And amongst these choices are what is the structure of our political economy as it relates to the role of each one of these social partners, as well as of key importance, the role of the state versus the role of the private sector. I'm going to give you, please, 2 minutes to share your thoughts on that question with us.
Okay, I think, yeah, no, there is a role to be played. I'm going to pinpoint the government here very, very importantly because of the role in policy direction. And we do understand that now and then we get to make input into the policies and into the laws that talks to what I'm going to talk about. We do believe that the issue of jobs, for instance, I'll just make an issue about jobs. When people mention that there will be jobs when we're doing all this work that we're doing, we should be able to have policy instruments that are directing to that effect. That if at all we need to be able to train people according to the new trajectory. And so government is at the pinnacle, if you, for lack of a better word, as a place where we can put everything together and formalize. For instance, I indicated earlier on that there is also the issue of the informal sector, which needs to be legitimized. And the only way to legitimize it through the policies, through government, taking a deliberate attempt to make sure that there is that happening. The last one that I think is very, very important is the issue of, I've mentioned the issue of the income divide. You know, we know there is the BIG or basic income grant, but that might not be enough. We need to find other creative ways that are deliberate to make sure that we cushion the poor against the unintended consequences of trying to mitigate and adapt. Let me just make a practical example. In the past few months, we've heard about people going to get some tax rebate when they've got solar panels on top of their roofs. But if you look at who it is intended for, it is intended for the middle class and the rich going upwards, but not for the poor. So there should be a policy direction, policy instrument that is formulated, and we are also part of that formulation. But we know it all culminates into laws and regulations and policies that the government may need to pass in order to make sure that we've got a deliberate way of dealing with poverty and the income divide, which doesn't have to be perpetuated in the just transition. And I think also the issue of your revenue streams of your municipalities. It is supposed to be conceived in our minds and in our hearts and be part of the direction the government takes to say, how do we cushion those that would lose the revenue streams simply because there is disinvestment from coal? We do believe there should be it shouldn't work itself out. There should be a way the government sits down with all of us as multi-stakeholders and come up with something very, very solid for the poor and the working class. Otherwise, we are going to have solutions for big businesses, like the green hydrogen story, which is understood by maybe the government and the big businesses than the poor and the working class. We'll see no need because it is not understood. It was conceived between government and business, and I'm not accusing, I'm just putting it out there that as trade unions, we are lagging behind with regards to that. There seems to be a space which we need to invade and sit on the table and understand fairly well what is this and where is it going, for whose class interest is it. Let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mbodi. I only see 2 hands up. I'm going to take them. Oh, there we go. Lufuno, you go first, please. 1 minute, please, each. And I'm hoping there'll be a rush of comments.
Thank you so much for the minute. I just want to make a recommendation. A lot of the information that we received today has proved that we have information divide, and it's not all of us that are included in these processes. We are in Gauteng, so it's easy to access the information, but if we were to talk about the majority, not everybody understands what we are discussing here in terms of climate change and just transition and how they can be involved because of digital divide. Even if those platforms are made available like Facebook, it's not everybody who will be able to connect. So I would like to propose that if we can maybe have a media strategy that uses the community radio stations through the GCIS and then a SABC education, that when this meeting is happening like now, for argument's sake, everybody is able to stay on to their community radio or any SABC radio, regional radio. They are using our languages so that we are not leaving anybody behind and perpetuating inequalities that we have been speaking about. So that will be my 1 minute contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Lufuno. Thank you very, very much for that. And I think our comms team and our stakeholder reach out team will certainly take that on board. Next would be David Kenvin, please. 1 minute.
The question I want to ask is about the promises made at COP26 here in Glasgow to finance South Africa's just energy transition, promises made by the UK, the EU and the USA. Very simple question, have they been delivered?
I'll hold that in abeyance towards the end of the comment section of this panel discussion. Thank you, David, for that very short question. Lucy Alley.
Hi, thanks, Deepak. So I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody in one of South Africa's universities, so from the university perspective. And what I just wanted to say briefly is that I think there's been such enormous technological advance in the last decade that the questions of the just transition are now not that much technological, but primarily social and political. The energy transition is happening, whatever we think about it, there's going to be an energy transition. The question is how just it is and how it happens. And it seems to me that there is enormous opportunity for South Africa to engage in real industrial policy and real planning, in real job creation and in real economic growth by embracing the energy transition. And in particular, that with our much more limited base for for example, for tech startups in a country like the US, there is enormous opportunity for partnership with universities. Our universities, I'm at WITS, but there are a number of excellent universities in South Africa, have an enormous base for, I think we need not to be seeing, we want to put solar panels around South Africa. Why aren't we manufacturing solar panels? Can we bring manufacturing back to South Africa, or new manufacturing, or develop manufacturing? And I think that partnership with the universities and the skills we have there is an absolutely essential part of doing that. I think it's really important that South Africa engages with questions of global justice in terms of, what developed countries should pay, but waiting for developed countries to acknowledge concerns of justice, we'll wait forever. We need to move on our own. And I think there's just enormous opportunities for us to develop our economy. And I think partnership with the universities is key. That's it.
Thank you very much for that, Lucy. I think very important message. Let's not wait like Godot or waiting for Godot for the rest of the world. We have a set of realities ahead of us, and we have a real political economy which we can orient towards taking advantage of the opportunities and dealing with the risks of the global transition. Next hand I saw was Basanda, please. Basanda Namblazi.
Thank you, Chair Deepak. Mine is just a comment to maybe reiterate what Comrade Modi was saying with regards to the legitimacy of the informal sector, because a lot of just transition projects, if you like, will claim the justice element based on the jobs. But when you look at these jobs, you find that most of them are temporal and informal. Although formalized jobs are the ideal, sometimes you can't provide those jobs. We have to settle with these temporal jobs. But I think there's more that could be done there as well when it comes to issues of social protection, so that when a just transition or the justice element is claimed in these projects using the token of jobs, it is meaningful jobs that address elements of social protection. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Short and sweet. Thank you, Basanda. Very important point. Miles Jacobs.
Thank you, Deepak. Remember, the cell phone revolution was very democratizing. It put a lot of almost like power in the hands of ordinary people. And I think the just energy transition is something very similar, you're literally putting power in the hands of people, and that has consequences in terms of things, for example, communications with cell phone charging. If electric vehicles, you can now sort of get more control over transport without importing oil. So it goes on like that. So I think one of the things maybe if government can also add this almost like a measurement unit, like we check educational level. Let's also see what sort of level we've got in terms of self-generation in the country. It's clearly something that's very positive as people take control of their own energy. And the second thing to track is as we replace imported energy, and it will start having effects on our currency and our balance of payments, that we also start to track the effect of putting in renewable energy on our economy. I think that's something that government would be very useful if government could do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Miles. Dexter King.
Thank you very much, Deepak. So I'm from HDF Energy. We're an IPP where we do green hydrogen power plants. And we're developing under the Eskom land tender close to 1,500 megawatts of solar coupled with 3,500 megawatt hours of hydrogen storage, where we can provide 24/7 baseload energy into the grid. The problem we're having is that Eskom or green hydrogen is not formed part of the Integrated Resource Plan of South Africa of 2019. And for Eskom to procure close to half a stage of load shedding, 500 megawatts that we will be injecting into the grid, green hydrogen would need to form part of the Integrated Resource Plan of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I don't see, Richard Worthington. No panel discussion would be complete without a comment from you. Please, we're all ears.
Deepak, you're too kind. Thank you. Well, it's partly a question, but also a comment. One of the dynamics around, for example, green hydrogen, but not only, is this argument that if we make this part of our package, then we can get concessionary investment into things that will help develop our energy system, which will be developed for the economy as a whole. So there is a public, and in theory, that can happen. But I think what we're hearing in this panel is that in practice, to make that happen, there must be much more effective and inclusive engagement. And so clearly there's an opportunity now to try and catch up on making this a social project that can work for all. Because if it's done right, it could have a lot of benefit. But if it's just project by project and chasing the profitable prospects in the short term, then we won't necessarily reap the national benefit. So, I mean, any thoughts on how to resolve that tension? But I do think it's got to be acknowledged, and that it just makes so much more the case of what Commissioner Mbodi and Bobby have been saying about taking a national approach to this and making sure that the benefits that are postulated by those people chasing concessionary investments are actually manifest and not just chasing the bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have warned a few people who are in attendance to be ready to make 1-minute contributions. I see they still haven't put their hands up, but while we wait for them to get ready, if we can unmute, oh, there we go, someone has come. Clement Mupuli.
Yebo, good afternoon, comrades. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Me, I would just like to make a comment about the political economy. Because my suggestion and my comment is, it is only the notice in political economy that who thinks it is a duty of a government to make its citizen happy. Because, after election, we get the new government, we get the new policies, we get a new manifesto, but the government has no office. Like now, we need to have a just transition office where all the rules won't be just modified or amended without consulting all the citizens of the country. But to protect the weak and the minority from the imposition of the strong and the majority. And we have to prevent anyone from positively working to render the peoples and to make the people unhappy, because other policies are not favoring mostly the marginalized people. They favor those who are already in business, like now the economists and also the people who owns the entities in the government. But if we may so express and do the labor not to be favoring only those who gain profit, but we must take the people's right first and not just to look at the economy, because also the political sphere affects and also impacts on the lives of the people, because each and every political leader got his own plans and his own manifesto. But moving forward, the just transition is the only office where no one is left behind, and every citizen and every stakeholder is involved. Now we need to move according to the just transition to change from what we were doing.
We have lost you, Clement. I'm going to now use the remaining 4 minutes to ask each of the panelists to share with us 30 seconds to 45 seconds, please. Your closing remarks before we hand over back to Lebogang as the coordinator to introduce Crispian, our executive director. We can start with you, Commissioner Mbodi.
Oh, thank you so very much. I think we shouldn't right now be afraid. We shouldn't walk away from the struggle to get reparations paid for those that have abused the climate and who now are giving money. We should be able to take a robust approach in our COPs meetings. Otherwise, the COP meetings will become another travel scheme. Lastly, it should also be understood that we cannot run just transition on our own on the fiscus. The fiscus can barely afford this. We need this money and we need to focus it on mitigation and adaptation and make sure that our people are happy with what we spending it like and how we are dispersing it to what good end. So I think what is important is to make sure that there is no corruption or fingers in the till, and so that we may not lose what is important due to corruption. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Mbodi. Next up, Dr. Faiza Balan. 30 seconds, please.
Thank you very much. I think that just in closing, I think that these platforms are a very good initiative to encourage consensus around the just transition. And because I feel that generally there doesn't appear to be consensus in terms of the way that government policy is proceeding around this. And I think it's because of what I said earlier, where there are many different constituencies with differing, deeply polarized views, and many and very contradicting viewpoints. So I think it's a very important process to aim to bring together these different stakeholders so that we could have a coherent policy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mashete Eddie Lakabe, 30 seconds. Eddie, you're muted.
Thank you. It's just to note that just transition is just as important as are the 15 sustainable development goals. So we should really take just transition as part of our development, and to also acknowledge that development is actually a sequence. So they are early adapters and they are most likely to win. They are late adapters, which are most likely to lose. So as we go forward around how we benefit from just transition, is very important that we adapt early, we develop the technologies early so that we can be part of the winners. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. Bobby, you're up next.
Thanks, Eddie. I would like to also consider us disruptors, not only adapters. So, you know, we need an African-wide pact on renewable energy minerals. So we can take control over the structure and how renewable energy minerals work. We cannot wait for developing countries around the political economy and be following that. We need to reshape the political economy with new rules. And, you know, BRICS you know, there's a lot of criticism, and I've criticized it as well, but we need to think about how we really reshape the global rules. Cell phones, interesting point. The US laid a whole lot of telephone lines. They never went, Africa never went from no telephones to telephone lines to cell phones. We leapfrogged it. So if we can leapfrog telephones, let's leapfrog dirty energy into renewable energy. And finally, we must remember that the North, the UN FCCC negotiations, as one shrouded with or one covered with mendacity. I mean, untruthfulness and lies, and Hillary Clinton is at the core of that, and every minister in this government knows that, and they should react appropriately.
Thank you, Bobby. Last word, Joanne, on the political economy of our transition.
Thank you. Just to say, Deepak, there are a whole set of questions in the chat around the JETP that there hasn't been time to respond to. And I think importantly, there will be a PCC session for the commissioners on the 18th of October on the JETP implementation plan. So I'm hoping that some of those can be held over. There's some great questions and comments. On this conversation, I really think there is a major opportunity there's a major risk for our country. We are not only highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but there's significant economic risks. On the other hand, we have a whole set of assets, and I think that we need to use them to, as Bobby says, look at how we leapfrog our economy. I also think that we need to invest very heavily in support for communities and workers to be organized so that they can decide what it is around the transition that they would want to do and how they want to do it. And I think that unless we invest in the kinds of community and worker initiatives and organizational development that would allow that, we are going to sit with a conversation that goes round and round. So I think this thing of organization and empowerment for me is a critical element of what do we need to invest in for a just transition. Thanks.
Thank you. Last 30 seconds from me. Panelists and contributors from the audience, thank you so very much. I think this is a very important topic, which I have no doubt will occupy us going forward. But let us remember, it's in strategic, united action that we will locate ourselves as a country in the right space, both in our region and in the global realities of political economy, as well as geopolitics and finance. With that, I hand back, I hand straight over to Crispian, our executive director.
Thank you, Deepak. I don't think I need Lebogang to introduce me, but thank you for the thought. So, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Crispian Oliver. I'm the executive director. And thank you, everyone, for what's been a really fascinating discussion. Certainly the minister and the panelists and the audience. I mean, I think we had some incredible inputs in this last half an hour. I'm not going to attempt a summary, but just to pick up on one or 2 points. Firstly, I really appreciated the comments about the global context. We clearly can't think about the local political economy without situating it within the global situation. And what we're seeking, as a number of you have pointed out, is an equitable sharing of risks globally between developed and developing countries based on our historical development patterns and our historical contribution to the climate crisis. But as a couple of you have pointed out, I mean, the global community is failing to get on top of runaway climate change. And we have a debate that's dominated by national interests, with naked conflict over technology, over resources, over supply chains, and a huge concentration by country and by capital in in particular supply chains. And we then need to think about how we're inserted into that global economy. And a couple of you have pointed out our challenges. I mean, as Joanne said, we're a small open economy. We're still predominantly a primary producer. We're very far from markets. We have a low productivity economy. And we've got this historical dominance of what a couple of you have referred to as the minerals energy complex. And, you've been very diplomatic in the way that you talk about the way that complex is inserted into our political economy. I mean, Faiza alluded to this when, she, in her book, which I really want to encourage those of you that are interested in these debates to read. She documented how Eskom, as a sort of key component of that complex, was inserted into the apartheid system and the systems of exploitation that it ran on. But equally, that same complex has been inserted into the new regime and into the political elites of today, old and new elites, and into an accumulation and rent distribution system, which, maybe has become a little bit more democratic, and at its lower ends, bleeds into the criminalization of the coal value chain and others. And all of, within that, the role of these big utilities like Eskom is fundamentally important. So we're dealing now with the limits of that accumulation model. There's been this ongoing concentration of capital, which, like capital everywhere, is footloose and fancy free. It's, to the extent that it can, it will evade its externalities, and it will not be tied to particular national economies. It will seek wherever it gets its best return. And a lot of the discussion we're having is on what terms does the continued accumulation of capital take place in our country. So we're seeing the limits of that model, and these huge drivers that a lot of you have referred to, this massive technological revolution that we're involved in, the repricing of energies and technologies, and a very rapid shift, which, if it's not managed correctly, I mean, for us in South Africa, is going to lead to an offshoring of large chunks of our production system, the loss of jobs, and a worsening of the poverty and inequality that marks our country. So, the question is, what is to be done? And, in asking that, famous Leninist line, if we're going to, in the spirit of political economy, we can't escape the Marxists. The question really is, what is under our control and what is not under our control? And I know a lot of you were talking about the pace of the transition. So how fast do we move? How do we calibrate that pace against the pace at which the global economy is moving, so that we're not left behind and not shut out of the global trading system? So I think, like some of you have said, the pace is not fully under our control. The global economy is moving. There's an energy transition underway. You can't stand like the boy with his finger in the dike and hold this tide back. But you can control how you respond to it. And as a lot of you have pointed out, there are opportunities in this transition for a far more decentralized and democratic and participatory economy. And Lucy mentioned, that the real shift now is on the social and the political issues around this transition. The scientific questions and the technological questions, I don't want to say they've all been answered, because there are obviously, as we heard today, some real debates around technology such as green hydrogen. But we're increasingly now grappling with the social and political challenges of this transition. And the things we can do is proactively invest in our labor force so that it's equipped for the economy of tomorrow. We can put, the incentives and the infrastructures in place to build out our local supply chains. And we can put the social support mechanisms in place that cushion workers as they move from one sector to the other, or need to transition to other forms of work. And we can also engage how we can also change how we engage. And I think you've heard very passionate arguments here today that a just transition cannot be just if it's not inclusive and if it's not finely calibrated to the concerns and needs of people that have the most to lose in this transition. So, when we talk about participatory justice and, making this a fair and equitable and participatory process, we do it, yes, it's the correct thing to do, but it's also, we won't get it right if we're not listening to those voices. It's going to once again revert to an elitist set of technocratic solutions that don't address the real challenges people face on the ground. So, sorry, I've gone 2 minutes over, Deepak, and I see you looking at your watch. But those are just some reflections from my side. I know it's not a complete summary, but thank you everyone for contributing today. It was a really excellent discussion.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Crispian. Thank you to all the panelists once again, and to all the attendees. You will watch this space. This is a dialogue that we will continue to have, and the transition is going to be a long one. So thank you very much for your continued participation in PCC events, and goodbye. Have a really good day. Bye-bye.